Good morning and welcome to our session on Google and Grackle, accessibility inside of the Google Suite. I am Sherry Prupis, Director of Teaching and Learning with Technology and Program Director for the Digital Accessibility Compliance Initiative. I am pleased this morning to have Paige Durham with us to do our session. Early next week, we will get you a recording and a couple of hint documents as well. I'm going to
I'll
turn
have
this
that
over.
today.
Ah, we're going to give that to you today. It is my pleasure to turn this over to Paige.
Good morning. Welcome and happy Friday to everyone. So I have a couple things that I want to. I think Sherry may have mentioned this, but I was concentrating on getting some more coffee. If you have questions or you need me to slow down because I go too fast, because that's when the coffee kicks in, then please use only. You don't have access to the chat, so that's not going to work. Please put your questions in the Q&A, and I will get to them at the end. There's my housekeeping. Do I need to introduce myself? Nah, we're good. We're moving on. All right, so I'm getting ready to make sure that you can see my screen. Yep. And let me make sure that it stays that way. All right, perfect. All right, and by the end of this hour, we're going to look at docs, sheets, slides, and a form. But you're going to learn how to make them a little bit differently because this is the easiest way to do it. But we're also going to talk about how you can take what you already have in your Google Drive and open up the extension called Grackle Docs or Grackle Sheets or Grackle Slides and help you to get them compliant. So, oh, oh, Gamma has a new thing. Okay, I don't know if I like the arrow, but we're going to go with it. So here's the part that most people don't really love to hear. So every document and form you create is a potential compliance artifact. The good news is that liability sits with the institution, not necessarily with you personally. No professor has been ever hauled into court over a bad PDF, but we also know that that's not out of the realm of impossible. So the moment that you post something for students or anyone else to the public, you are the distributor. You own its accessibility, whether that's a doc, sheet, slide, or form. So the cheapest fix is to that you never have to make. So remediation after the fact is slow and a little bit tedious, but building it is fast and almost invisible. So that's what we're going to do today. And we'll, let me see if I can, there we go. There's the arrow. So we're going to start with something that I feel like most people may use more than the other Google tools, and that's Google Docs. So three things that really matter the most: real heading styles, and that means that it isn't just bold text and with a big font, right? That's just a costume. So a screen reader cannot tell the difference between a real heading 2 and a 14-point bold, and your students who navigate by headings on the left are wandering. So you need to have one heading 1 and then logical nesting with no skipped levels. And it should be sentence case. Please understand, anytime that you use all caps for anything, that tells the screen reader to read each individual letter at a time as if it were an acronym. So second you want to do is look at the real list tools like bullets and numbers and descriptive links. Descriptive links meaning you can't say click here, right? That doesn't tell a screen reader listener anything. You need to tell them where the link goes. Third, if you have alt text, you want to use the acorn, and that would be all caps and spelled ACORN by a screen reader because it is all caps, and it means accurate, concise, objective, relevant, and necessary. So set your document language so the screen reader pronounces things correctly. Remember that your color contrast should be 4.5 to 1, and never let color be the only thing that carries the meaning. So, oh, there we go. Sorry, the mouse is. So let's go over to wherever my window is, which sometimes is easier to find than others. And I'm going to reshare. There we go. All right, I'm going to try to make this a little bit bigger. This is a little wonky right now. There we go. All right, so here you can see I have a Google Doc. Pretty easy, nothing spectacular about it. And from the looks of it, it looks like, well, that maybe it has some, maybe it doesn't have anything, maybe it does, some accessibility problems. So the first thing that you can do, if you want to, is you can click in the, where I would think that is the title, right? And you can see that it is a heading 1. So that tells me that that is correct. Now, does this image contain alt text? I don't know. Do you know? Let's look. So in order to see that alt text, you're going to right click and then you're going to be able to see the alt text. Ah, you can see now there is no alt text for that. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to open my snipping tool and I'm going to take a picture just of that image. And I'm going to make a copy of that. And I'm going to move the zoom toolbar out of the way. And now I'm going to pop over to Gemini. But I need a new conversation, so let's start a new chat. So here I am now in Gemini. Gemini is part of your VCCS Google package. And I'm going to paste in that image that I took just as a snipping tool. I need alt text for this image. Okay, that wasn't a great prompt, but we're going to go with it for now. Now, that is great. That's good alt text. I can't complain about that at all. But what I can say is this, it's too long. I need that in less than 150 characters. Now it's going to be, that was good alt text again for the purpose of having great alt text, but I don't want that much alt. I want something short and sweet. So now I'm going to take this and I'm going to go back to Google Docs and I'm going to go back to where we were here and delete that. And now, again, that's my, now we have alt text. Now, if you're wondering if when I clicked away from that, if it went away, it does not. Remember that Google auto saves for you. All right, so that's going to be how you would get alt text. That doesn't matter whether you're in slides, sheets, docs, form, whatever. However you need alt text. This is the way, that's the easiest, fastest way to get it if your image is kind of complex. So now we're going to go click here. So we can see that this is already labeled as a H2. And this is an H3, an H2, H3. And now, that I will tell you was automatically done. So I'm going to click on this, edit the link. So if I go in here and let me copy this and go back, and I want to show you what I mean by automatic. Let's make a few spots here. And I'm going to paste this in. So you can see that's the link. And we don't want that as a raw link. We want this as a real link. So now if I make that a hyperlink, and now I go back here and I hover over that link, do you see where it says at the very bottom of that pop-out, replace URL with this title? So it's helping you figure out the descriptive text. So I don't have to necessarily write it myself. I can simply put in yes, and now you can see that I have the correct alt text. I'm sorry, descriptive text. Brain is on alt text. All right, so that's how you can do that. So if you hover over any link in your document, you're generally going to get a little pop-out window. That pop-out window is either going to do one of two things. It's going to show you what you see here, which is already given the descriptive link, or it's going to ask you at the bottom in blue if you want to replace the link with a descriptive title. So the next piece is we're back to headings, and then we have planets. Now we're on to a table. So in the table, we need to figure out whether or not the table has a header. So let's, not that. Pardon all of my computer noises. Well, we're going to skip this for a hot minute. Now let's go look at the color coding, right? So we have blue, red, green, purple, and maybe they're compliant, maybe they're not. Now, I don't have in this specific browser that I'm using currently an eyedropper tool that will actually grab the color so that you can test it to see if it meets the 4.5 to 1. So, and then we have another image, and that's the end of this document. So that's kind of just an overview of us looking at it without using any kind of tool. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to extensions, and I'm going to go to Grackle Docs, and I'm going to click launch. Now, there are some, okay, and pray that it works. There are a few other things that you should be aware of. When you are in your VCCS account, in order for Grackle to run correctly, you have to make sure that you are also signed into the browser with your VCCS account. If you are signed into your browser with your personal Gmail account and you're trying to log into Grackle with your VCCS, the two are going to conflict, and you are not going to see at the bottom where it says Grackle Docs licensed. If you do not see that at the bottom, then you are not in, you have a conflicting either browser issue or something else. You should not see 30-day trial or trial expired. You all should see Grackle Docs licensed. Okay. So once you've checked that, because that's gonna determine when we export, you're gonna start seeing the document title is required. Google, unlike Microsoft, is smart enough to actually put the title of the document into the metadata, which means that you don't have to go find the info and put it in like you do in Word. It already does that for you as long as there's something up here in this top left-hand box. The second thing is you're going to have to specify the language. To set the language, it's the easiest thing to do is click the button, and then you're going to go down to the bottom and click English and click Update. And now you have set the language. But notice that the X didn't go away. That's because I need to recheck it in order for that error message to drop off. Okay, so it's telling us that all of the documents are tagged appropriately. But let's look at this last one. Okay, so the last tag, and I'll pull the picture up too. Well, hold on. Okay, so mark this image as an artifact means that it is not something that a screen reader should read. So in order to do that, I'm just going to go ahead and click that, and then I will click Update. All right, so now I have done that. Headings should be used, and we have those. So if you notice here, we have locate, locate. That's just going to be the order. It tells us here a single heading 1 should be used, and headings must be properly nested. And they are. We already looked, and we know that this is a heading 1, this is a heading 2, and so forth, or heading 2 and heading 3, excuse me. And then now we're going to go down to that table, which we already know I knew was going to be a problem. So from here, I'm going to go ahead and click Tag and take a sip of coffee. Now, when you first open this window first opens and you have tag table, you have a couple options. So I know that a lot of people tend to use tables for layout. That is not a good practice for accessibility. I understand that it happens, but if you notice the very first box up here is table is used for layout only. You could check that box, and that means that the screen reader would understand it's really not a table and it will read the contents. However, we actually have a table, so I'm going to go ahead and choose the first row as the header. So that tells when the screen reader reads it, it's going to read planet, Tatooine, region, outer rim, climate, arid desert, notable for home of the Skywalkers. Then it will be row two, planet, Coruscant, region, core worlds, climate, urban, notable for Galactic Republic capital. So that's how a screen reader is going to read that. That's why your header row is super important. Now, it could be a column. It doesn't have to always be a header row, but you do need to make sure that you have marked either one or both as the header. So I'm going to go ahead and update that. And now I'm going to keep on scrolling down. So this document does not contain a header and a footer. Now, this is a preference. Again, this is not a hard and fast rule for WCAG 2.1. This is, if you hover over this, you can see that it says passed with warning. And that's also why the circle, if you're not colorblind, you can see is not red or green. It's actually brown. So that is the difference. Oh, excuse me. That when you're seeing that. Now, the next one is document should not contain unsupported elements. Unsupported elements are things like a horizontal bar, emojis, although emojis are okay, but they're not great. And then notice that we have high color contrast should be used. So now we know that these colors over here, although we weren't sure, we do now know that they are okay and they do meet the compliant ratio. Fine print should be avoided. So what's the normal size font that you should use in a document? That's 12-point font. If you are doing a presentation, however, it should be 18-point, but we'll get there. All caps should be avoided. I've already talked to you about why that is. And alignment adjusted, not suggested for non-heading text. So I'm not sure what it's talking about, so let's go find it. Well, I'm not looking at anything. Oh, it is the image. Okay, so that's kind of like it likes things left justified, although center justification is not wrong. This is why it says passed with warning. Lengthy paragraphs should be avoided and links should be informative. And we've already passed all of those. So now if I recheck this,
Paige, when the screen you're showing us, when the text matters, can you make it a little larger?
yeah, I can't
Thank
make
you.
the grackle window any bigger though.
Okay.
Um, So looking at this, now you see we are check here, checks here, all the checks here, and we still have those two that are left, but again, we don't care about those really because they are just passed with warning. They're just suggestions, not things you need to fix. The next piece that we're going to look at is document structure. So this is pretty easy to understand when we're looking at something like a document and it reads top to bottom, right? This is it's a little bit different when we're looking at something like slides, which we'll get to. So we can see here that we have heading, paragraph, image, heading, paragraph, heading, list, and that's actually a real list, okay? And it's a real list. Why? Because if I click right here, you can see the tool up here at the top also lights up. And that's the best way that you can see it. Although, Sherry, isn't there a zoom option, a zoom in option in Zoom? Am I misthinking? I don't think I can do it because
I'll look around. If I find it, I'll put it in chat.
okay. I don't know the answer to that. All right. So I just had sorry. squirrel thought. And now you have a few more things here. And you see that this is exactly how it should be. The table, oh, let me not do that. The table, it says this is the header row, and then it gives the information. So you can see that is how that, you can also refresh or locate based on whatever you want to look at. And that's a nice little feature. Okay, so now I want to go over here to the 3 lines of Grackle and talk about these. So here you have a few things that we have: copy with tags, paste with tags, clear the tags, reset the reading order, and we have clone document. So if you are having problems with Grackle and you've done 2 things, you've checked the browser that you're in and made sure that you are logged in with your VCCS account and not your personal or another Gmail account. That's first thing. And 2, you want to make sure that you see Grackle Docs licensed at the bottom. If you're still having problems with Grackle, what I would do is I would come here, I would clear all the tags, and then recheck it. That generally resets it and does allow you to continue on. So now I'm going to go to export PDF. So, well, no, I won't go there yet. We all know that in Google, you have the download option, and you can download as a docx, Word document, a PDF, ODT, plain text, rich text, web page, markdown file. None of that matters. Most people want it as a PDF. However, if you use the native Google PDF tool, you're going to find that your PDF is no longer accessible. So to do this correctly and have an appropriately accessible PDF, you're going to export to PDF. And I took a long time on Docs because slides and everything else is going to be kind of similar. Start, and it's going to submit the request. And now we're going to, you can either download it or you can see where it's uploaded to your Google Drive. Please note that it does upload automatically to your Google Drive. All right, so that is Google Docs. So when we are in Google Slides, it's a little bit different. Real layouts with titles and body and placeholder are super, super important. So give me 1 second. So there's one sneaky trap with slides, and that's a title. Every slide needs a unique, meaningful title. Even if you hide it visually, that's how a screen reader a user uses to move and navigate through the deck. Slide, slide, slide is not navigation. So use real layouts with slide title and body placeholders so the structure is actually there. So reading order follows the arrange order. So on any busy slide, make sure you check it. It's also on the build order, the order in which you added things to the slides. So alt text is needed on images and shapes. So decorative stuff, make sure you mark it as an artifact, which means it's decorative and a screen reader would skip it. Please do not trap your one important sentence inside of text, an image of text where no screen reader can even reach it. All right, so now let's look at some a Grackle slides demo. So it's the same as Docs, but a little bit different surface. So the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to go find my slides that are maybe open. Sorry. Now let's take a look at, here we go, right window. Huh. All right, so now we are in slides. Again, same idea of what do we see versus what's actually important, right? So I will tell you that all these little dots are actually um, items that would need alt text. So it's not part of the background, they're actually dots. Very problematic, honestly, if you were thinking about this. It's cute, but super complex. So that's an issue. So now let's click and see, do we have this marked as a title? So, well, we don't know because that's the problem with Google is this doesn't tell you whether or not this is actually a title. Um, if we're looking, we see alt text, but there is no way to actually look and see if there is a title to this specific slide. Now, I could apply a layout. Notice that because I've built this way, there are no options. But you could, if you were in a different theme, you could actually apply a layout that might have a title. So there's a lot of things in this that you're going to see. And now let's go ahead and take a look at the extension and Grackle and see what it picks up. All right. So, well, we got two things, right? Which is great.
In the chat, I put the link for the Grackle guide. Grackle is paid for the entire VCCS. It is installed, but you need to add it as an extension, as
So
we showed in the very beginning. So I put the Grackle guide for you in the chat, so you'll know how to do it on.
perfect. All right. So now let's go back to the first slide. So let's take a look, and we see that the presentation title is required, that document language is specified. And here we have the problems. A slide should have a title, and none of these slides have a title. So how are we going to fix this? Well, that's very problematic because there is no way to fix this in this current format. So now what I do see up here at the top, if you notice, is there is a title that's up here in this box. Now that title is what we call a hidden title. And it's hidden because it's above the slide, but a screen reader actually would read that to someone who needed it. So if I took that slide and, in other words, left that title at the top, then what it's going to do is the screen reader would read it. Now, there are a few more things that we can talk about from here. When we are adding a title, to any slide. Now we think all of these have titles, but they don't. You can see that there is no way to add this as a title, even by right clicking. So in order to do that, you actually should be in a better, a better theme. But that's on me, not on you. That's my choice. But this is because I created this outside of Google, and that's why it's a little bit, well, we're going to go with wonky. Now, the other thing that you need to notice here is that a slide title should be unique. So now let's talk about these two slides. So we have the Jedi Order and the Jedi Order V2. The importance of this is that the V2 is here. And that's and now, if you choose to not make this visible, so let's say you wanted to keep it because you have a slide that says continued or whatever, or the same slide title twice, you have to put a unique identifier and it has to be something. So you have an option here to go in here and change the color from yellow to black. And now if I click away from this, you're not even going to see it. But a screen reader would see it and it would read it to someone who was was having it read to them. So that's how you can make a slide title unique. A slide should not be empty. You shouldn't have a blank slide in the middle of a presentation. All tables should be tagged. I don't know if I have a table. I don't have a table in this. Merge cells is not recommended. The use of empty cells is not recommended. Now let's go to alternative text. Again, we have images, wherever they are. And you can see here, it's the ship that's at the bottom. And I could just mark this as an artifact and move on. An artifact means that a screen reader will skip it. It's the same thing that you see in Microsoft that says decorative. Same idea, just two different words. So these are the images. So elements should have alt text. Remember what I said to you earlier about shapes should have alt text. Please notice all of those things that it picked up. Every single rectangle, I don't know if it's going to show it. Yeah. These rectangles, these blue rectangles over there, they're all tagged, which means a screen reader would read them if you do not mark them as artifacts. So that's how those are. So anything that is a shape or an item, those are all going to be required to mark as artifacts and make sure that they are skipped with a screen reader. Now, text boxes should not be empty. Lists should not be broken apart. Fine print should be avoided. High color contrast. Now, in this example, we have some things here that are, it's telling you that some rectangles and other things are not color contrast. Part of this, let me see if I can give you an example. The rectangle that's around this, and I know you can't see it. If I unclick, you can't see that there's even a rectangle there. But there is a very light gray border around this rectangle, and you can either do one of two things. You can make it black. I don't know if I can. And now it should, and now that would be, and you still kind of can see it if you, but it's really hard. So that's something else to keep in mind. So when you're looking at these things, that's what they mean. So when you're looking at color contrast here, it's telling you FFFFF on FFFFF, that's white on white. And I can tell you that. And I will show you where you can go to check out colors if you're not sure. It is WebAIM Contrast Checker. And so you see here that FFFFFF is white and 00000 is black. Okay, so if you want as great a contrast as you possibly can get, you see that the ratio here is 21:1. Now, if I go back to this and I pick up, I have no idea what E8, 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 E8 is. Let's go take a look. So I can go pick that up, come back here, and now well, that didn't give me any color. Interesting. Okay, well. Wow, what happened? Did I break this? Oh, that's always fabulous. E8, E8, E8. There we go. It's gray. I have no idea what I did before. So E8, E8, E8 is gray. And you can see that this is a color contrast problem because look at the bottom down here. Nothing passes. But I have some sliders up here that will let me change the color till I can get a pass rate. Now, for a presentation, large text is what we want. So now I know that 737373 is what I need. And the question is can I go back here and change that? Rectangle. and border color. And that's how you would change it. You would click on the rectangle, take you there, go to the border color, and then you could fix whatever it is. And now you can actually kind of see it. I don't know why you would need to do that, but it's okay. So there it is. So now the next thing is inline styles may lack clear meaning. Oop. So this is saying that yeah, I'm going to mark this as an artifact. It's the rectangle again that is trying to force you into alt text. Okay, so now we've gone through that, but now I want to go to slide structure because this is very problematic. Can I make this bigger? Probably not. So you can see all these ellipses are red because we didn't give them alt text. I should be able to. I can't. Hold on one second. I don't know why I can't make this bigger. So each time you click on these, you can see that this would be red. So there's no way to change the alt text here. But if you notice, there's a rectangle and then it tells you what's inside of the rectangle. But anything that is red is problematic. And that's why it's telling you. And now you can move things around. For example, in slide 6, if I wanted to the learn more piece, I can drag that to somewhere else. So you can see that's how you would change the reading order for these. And that's the easiest way to do it is to drag and drop. So again, you have the option to export the tag, export options, clone, clear, toggle tips if you need them. And then we have the option to also export to an accessible PDF once we've made all of the changes. All right, moving right along. And I'm watching the clock. All right, so we've checked the title, we understand alt text, color contrast, and reading order. So now let's talk about Google Sheets. Oops, sorry. So sheets are where good intentions go to merge cells, right? One clean data table per sheet. Don't put a lot of things on a single sheet. A single header row with unique column headers. And the big one, do not merge cells inside of a table. Merging looks good, but it completely shatters the row and column relationship that a screen reader needs to be dependent. It is the number one thing that people have a problem with. So you can always use justify over a number of cells if you need something to look like they're merged cells, but they are not. So you also need to make sure that every tab has a real name because sheet 1, 2, and 3 helps no one. And you need to convey any kind of status with a label or symbol and not just color alone. So also if you have charts, the charts have to have alt text. All right. So now we're going to take a look at a sheet. Page ever hits the right button. All right. So here you can see we are now in a Google Sheets, and there we have a row up here at the top. As you can see, I don't know why it's whacked off over here, but that's okay. We'll figure it out. Let's see if I do that. Will that fix it? Yes. All right. So now you can see that we have that top row, And that's problematic, right? Because technically speaking, which row is our header row? It's the second row is our header row, right? But notice that we have the option here to convert to a table. Ooh. Now, you can choose to do that. Google's nice enough to tell you that. If you notice that there are some drop downs rather than you can convert it, or I can leave it like it is. I'm going to stop moving around because that's making me nervous. So each sheet has a title. Okay, that's good. And do we have anything that defines color? I don't know. So let's go. Ugh, let's go to Grackle for sheets. Again, the first thing you're noticing it's looking for is a proper title and language. Sheet name should be descriptive. Number of sheets should be reasonable. You shouldn't have a spreadsheet with 14 tabs. That's what it's saying. So sheets should not be empty. You shouldn't have any blank sheets. Tables should have headers. Ah, here it is. All right. So now this table is on the first one. So let's see what we got. With header row, header column, or both types. So now we have marked the table, and now it has a header. Table should not be long. The number of tables should be reasonable. Merge cells. High color contrast. Here we go. So you can see here that cell F3 on sheet 1 does not have, it's the green, right? So what I can do is I could take this, highlight all of this, go up here and make this a much darker green, and do the same thing with the red. And let's recheck it and see if that passes. Your print size on sheets isn't any different than docs. It should be 12 point. At 11 is the smallest that you should go if you have to go lower. So make sure that you have checked those. So now that I changed those green and red, notice that now I'm good to go. So that is something that you can do pretty easy. But notice that the color is not the only thing that it conveys the meaning. The other piece of it is that it has the word active in there. So that's how you can figure out whether or not it is appropriate. So that's Google, that's Sheets in a nutshell. I know that's not a lot, but it's very repetitive. Grackle does a lot of the work for you. And I do want to spend, we have 15 minutes and I don't want to leave out forms. So let's go back and work on forms. All right, so I've shown you Sheets. You want to fix the structure and then rerun it. So Google Forms, why use them? And how are they better than a fillable PDF? Well, they're better than a fillable PDF because they are automatically screen reader accessible. So when you are thinking about building a form, you want to think about what information am I trying to get? If it requires a signature, or multiple signatures. Actually, let me rephrase that. If it requires multiple signatures, then this is not going to be your answer, right? So a fillable PDF is one of the hardest things that you could possibly do to keep accessible. It needs manual tags, correct tab order, labeled fields. It breaks the second someone opens it on a phone. Google Forms is keyboard and screen reader friendly right out of the box, with zero tagging work from you. Forms also flow to mobile. PDFs do not. So your responses also land straight in a sheet, so you are not creating a second inaccessible artifact from the form. Forms win, and that's why. So The key, though, to building forms is basically it's thinking about clear label text on every question. So when you're building a form, put the instructions in the description field, not as a placeholder, right? You can also use a hint um, in Google Forms so that if you want to say, please include your phone number, and your hint is that you want the first three numbers in parentheses and a dash between the the last seven, then you can show that as a secondary information. So alt text has to have the images in Google Forms. It's not any different. And also a theme is, excuse me, going to help you keep it compliant. You also in forms can mark required questions so that you make sure that you get all of the information that you need. So if you don't know what question types to use in Google Forms, um, this is going to be the slide you are going to want to remember. Okay, these are the kind of the questions you don't want to use. Any kind of multiple choice, checkbox, or grid, right? So these are questions fight assistive technology. So grids, both multiple choice and checkbox, are brutal for screen readers and on mobile. They split them into separate questions, and that is a problem. Image only choices fail anyone who cannot see the image. So always add a text label and never make the picture the only way to answer. Linear scales need both ends labeled in plain language because 3 means nothing on its own. And the last one is a file upload that requires a Google sign-in, which can exclude people so make sure you offer some kind of alternative. So when you are looking, that's the easiest way. So Grackle does not check forms. So now let's take a look at a Google form.
I'm Gemini from home, a helpful assistant. I can help organize your day, find a recipe for dinner, or chat about almost any topic. For example, if you're
Hey
curious
Google,
about the world,
stop talking. Okay,
ending our chat.
sorry. Things talk to me. All right, so here we are in Google Forms, and pretty simple. You just add a question, excuse me, and continue to the next question. I can tell you that, well, let's go down here. Let's click on this, and we're going to go multiple choice. Actually, let's go short answer. No, now, except I can't spell today. And you can see that we have text here. Now, what you can do is if I want to add any kind of helper text, I can add it here. But that's the best way to add it. Or I can add, if you notice here, if you click on the three dots, I'll get the words out in a minute. Click on the three dots, you can add a description. And that's going to allow you to put that helper text in there where you can say, please only list one from Star Wars. That's going to be your helper text, right? So now that second part, this is a question I get asked often. This bottom piece right here does not get put into the column headers in your Google Sheet that will collect the forms. So that's how you can think about what do you want to put in the helper text. Because if you include it in this top piece, that means it gets added to the header column in the Google Sheet where you're going to collect all the form responses. So that's kind of important. Now, the next piece of thing that you might want to add is I'm going to add another question. I'll do this one. What is the date of? Okay, so now we have a date, right? And I want to make this a date. So I'm going to go ahead and put in that. But now we have a problem because it says month, day, year. Well, what happens if you are in you're not a Native American and your normal date is doesn't come make month, day, year. It goes year, month, day. That's a problem. So let's go here and include the description. Again, we can put in the helper text, and that's going to allow us, please use month, day, year, example, 06, 07, 1977. Okay, and there we have it. And there's even a little calendar that they could click on, but there it is. So there's also an option for you to, let's go back up here. No, this question. There we go. Why is this? Oh, I know. Never mind. I know what it's doing. I need to add one more question. So now I want to add, and I'm going to make this a short answer. And now I can go here to response validation. So response validation allows you to choose text length, regular expression, greater than, and a number. And then you can also give an error text. And the reason that I bring this up is student ID numbers, right? Because students come to us from other places where they've had other numbers that identify them, i.e. their cafeteria number in high school. And it is not going to be their MPL ID that they need in, or that their number in SIS. So you can put in something that will make sure that you get the right response without having to contact the student again and explain, no, I need your SIS ID, not your cafeteria number from high school. So this is a way to do that in Google Forms. Now, again, I said that you could collect responses. If I go up here, you would link it to a sheet. It makes a sheet. You can also, if I go up here to the top, you have to accept you have to allow it to accept responses. You have to publish it. And this is the link that you would send out for someone to do. Now, the other few things that you can look at, you can add collaborators. That way you can also pre-fill a form. You can put add-ons. You can unpublish it. You can trash it. You can also preview it so you can take a look. You can change the theme. And these are add-ons. The settings, if I wanted to make, oh, let me go back here. You notice that you can limit it to one response. You can allow the student or whoever's filling it out to receive a copy of their response. It will collect email addresses based on the responder input. And notice the difference between is do not collect verified and responder. If you choose verified, that means they can only access this with their VCCS email, and you're going to get 9,000 emails about how they can't access it because they're on their phone trying to complete it. Just saying. All right. So the last
Paige, a quick question.
Yeah,
You
I know I got 5 minutes.
I know you had said for multiple choice and checkbox are problematic. Do you
Yes.
mean when they're in grid
Yes.
form?
Yes.
Okay,
The grids. Yep. So if I
thank
go
you.
back here and I click on this and I click here and you see that where's that multiple choice grid and checkbox grid, do not use those. That's
Okay,
what I'm talking about. You can use
and
anything. Yeah. Go
the
ahead.
second question here is a lot of us use branching in our Google Forms.
And that's
So
fine.
if they say yeah, okay, so that doesn't create an accessibility
Nope,
issue.
it does not.
Thank you.
Yep. And you can see here, there's continue to the next section. And this is exactly where I could have, are you a Star Wars fan? There is branching already in this. It says go to section 2, no, submit a form. So there's already branching here, and that does not break the form. What breaks the accessibility piece in forms is really the question type. So last 2 slides, and then I have a meeting at 10. So structure, Make sure you use one H1, no skipped levels. Images and links need to have alt text and never click here or read more. Color contrast is 4.5 to 1. And sheets and slides, no merge cells, clear headers, unique titles, and run Grackle on sheets, docs, and slides. And now I'm going to give you, because I said I was, link. And we're hoping this works because Paige has got a lot of.
And early next week, we will share the slide deck, the recording,
So,
and the links that are here. We will share that with you as well.
all right. And the last slide has important information. And I'm also going to give you a copy of the slides. Just give me a minute. This information is key. So test with Microsoft Narrator. If you're not sure how to do that, just Google it. And not the read aloud option in Microsoft. Please do not think that that is a screen reader. It is not. If you try to use that as a screen reader, it's not going to work. So here is a link to the presentation. And since I accidentally shared this to the wrong group, I'll share it again. And now that's a link to a handout for this workshop. The second thing is in the slide presentation itself is also a link to the handout. Sherry already put in the link to the resource hub, and my email is the last thing on the last slide. So happy Friday. And I did it in an hour, and that's a lot of information. Welcome to Speeding with Drinking from a Fire Hose with Paige on Friday. So I hope, please, my office hours are kind of paused until July the 6th. However, I will be available through email. Please feel free in the next 2 weeks to email me, and I will respond. Or next week, whatever. I don't know. I can't do math. And that, like I said, I will respond with email. And my email is almost what Sherry typed, but not quite. It's pdurham@vccs.edu. And that's it. And thank you to the 100 people that hung out. All right, so we have a few raised hands. So Sherry, let me see, where'd they go? Oh, Q&A. Please resend the material links. Okay, we'll do my best.
I am muted and I was speaking and I was brilliant. Everybody have a very good day. Office hours resume July 6th. Webinars will resume in August, but please reach out to us with questions. We're always answering questions. Thank you very much.
Put the links back in. They should be fine. And you're very welcome. Have a super day.